Welcome everyone to the inaugural CEN Book Club event. We're hoping to make this a regular format for CEN supporters to hear about the latest books on nature conservation, on climate change and environmentalism. Thank you to our outreach manager, Izzy Goodwin, for organising tonight's event. I'm delighted to welcome Lee Schofield. Lee is an ecologist by background and is the site manager at RSPB Haweswater, a landscape scale nature reserve which incorporates two working farms. Lee is the author of Wildfell, Fighting for Nature on a Lake District Hill Farm, which is an account of his attempt to reconcile nature restoration and food production on a remote Lake District farm. Haweswater Reservoir provides drinking water for 2 million people, and the recovery of peats, woodland and scrub on the RSPB reserve is reducing runoff, mitigating flooding and droughts, capturing carbon and recovering biodiversity. Such is its success that the International Union for Conservation of Nature recently recognised RSPB Haweswater as one of only 5 sites in the UK to meet its global standard for nature-based solutions. I've had the privilege of visiting Haweswater myself, and it is absolutely stunning, and the work that Lee and his team are doing there is incredible. So Lee, I wanted to kick off with a bit of background to the book and how you came to write it for those who haven't read it yet. So could you outline kind of what triggered you to write the book, and what is the story that you're trying to tell?
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, firstly, thanks for asking me along. So the book is really, it's an account of the 9 years that I've been the site manager at Haweswater. It's on one level a story of the ecological changes that we're making. It goes into a fair bit of detail about the wildlife, particularly the kind of botanical side of things. The plant life is quite an important theme for the book, and how healthy, diverse plant life underpins the whole of the rest of the food chain. But it's also a personal book as well. So I'm an employee of the RSPB, of course, but I'm also clearly a human being, and doing nature conservation in somewhere like the Lake District, which is a pretty politically charged kind of place when it comes to land management and farming, has taken a fairly heavy toll on me, and I think it does on anybody who's working in nature conservation or indeed in farming. We've got quite a polarized, very heated debate around perceived binary choices of rewilding versus farming, and what I wanted to show was actually that there's a way to find a bit of a middle ground, and to manage land in a way that produces a whole range of different things, food included. So yeah, the one sort of trigger point that inspired me to write it was we had a meeting with the World Heritage Steering Group. So the Lake District became a World Heritage Site in 2017. And we had a sort of a delegation from the World Heritage Steering Group, which was made up of representatives of National Trust, Forestry Commission, Lake District National Park Authority, and a few others. And they were basically coming to tell us what being in a World Heritage Site meant for our management of the site, and what we had to do, what extra kind of bureaucracy was associated with it. And it was all fairly straightforward and fairly dull, if I'm honest. And at the end, I was quite interested to know how this World Heritage Site, which is all really based on the farming traditions, sheep farming traditions. That's the kind of the primary, most recognizable element of it. I wanted to ask how a big organization like the RSPB taking on 2 hill farms was perceived within that new sort of World Heritage framework. And it was explained to us that when the World Heritage Site was designated, that they had to accept that there were a number of warts on the face of the World Heritage property, and the RSPB's presence at Haweswater was one of those warts. So myself and my colleagues who'd worked for years at Haweswater, this is not just a job to me, this is like my life's work, and it's the same for several of my colleagues. To just to have it dismissed in that way was pretty offensive, really. And so I started kind of writing bits and pieces as a way to kind of hone how I might respond to that sort of an accusation again in the future. And initially the writing was all very sort of cathartic and shouty, but slowly started to sort of craft it and realized that by bringing in some of the fascinating stories about the area, like the fact there's a flooded village underneath the reservoir, the fact that we were, Horsewall was home to the only eagles in the whole of England for decades. Felt like, there was a story that was worth telling. And I was, lucky enough to sort of accidentally bump into an agent, and it kind of all happened from there, really.
Well, it's been a tremendous success, and it's a fantastic book. And I wondered if you could go into a bit more detail about the historical context in the Lake District, the kind of history of kind of conventional fell farming, but also how it's changed, particularly since the Second World War, but even more so in the late 20th century. And in the book, you talk about it being a contested landscape. Why is that? Why is there such a polarization between conservation on the one hand and farming on the other, or a perceived polarization and a kind of binary choice, as you say?
So I think the key thing that most of us forget, and this probably applies to many walks of life, is that things are always changing. There's no such thing as a kind of a fixed point in time where farming or politics or anything else is perfect. That we are always, all of these systems, all of these human created systems are just constantly adapting. Sometimes they're improving, sometimes they're not, but they're kind of, these things are our own creation. They are the sum of all of our kind of desires and our needs, if you like. And farming has, it's gone through this thousands of years of evolving. And a few hundred years ago, farming in the Lake District was mostly a pretty kind of subsistence type affair. Farms were pretty small, they were quite diverse. They had pigs and cattle and sheep and ponies, geese and chickens. And if you're in a place where you haven't got the option to just go and buy in a load of extra produce, you've got to grow it yourself, haven't you? So these were places that were eking out probably quite a meager and certainly very challenging existence in what is quite a harsh landscape, one that doesn't particularly want to give up a great deal of produce. And so, over the course of centuries, those farms have modernized, taken on, new innovations. The scythe was replaced by the tractor, and, different practices. Fields were enclosed. And these changes, the landscape was kind of tamed more and more to become more and more productive. And then, as you said, the biggest change really was after the Second World War, when things really, really intensified, and there was this big push for food security, and the introduction of headage payments through the Hill Livestock Compensatory Allowance sort of really rocket fueled how the farming system up here operated. And by paying farmers per head of livestock, the sensible thing for them to do was to increase them as much as they possibly could. And the type of livestock that's the easiest to increase is sheep. It takes, you're getting a couple of lambs per year. So actually you can build up a flock really quite quickly, much more quickly than you can with cattle. So sheep kind of became this completely dominant livestock type where they hadn't really been so before. And a lot of the other sort of diversity in the farming system fell away. So, when you look around, I refer to place names a lot in the book, and there's lots and lots of place names associated with cattle, with goats, with pigs, with geese. There's actually not as many associated with sheep. There are some, obviously, but they're not, and that says an awful lot about how much more diverse the farming system was until, relatively recently. And the second part of your question was,
why is it so contested?
Yeah, why is it so contested? So I think any kind of change, and we're on the cusp of a revolution in land management across the world. We need to make land work better for the climate, for biodiversity, for water quality, for flood risk reduction, for all of those things. Making the landscape more resilient to the impacts of a changing climate needs to be our priority. And so there is just a very natural fear of change among many people, most people probably, and farmers, I think, are typically a fairly conservative bunch. They are very, with a small c, I mean, they are, very passionate, very knowledgeable, very connected to their places. and yet they've always been at the kind of well, for the last 100 years or so, they've been at the whim of public policy. And that public policy has been asking them to do one thing for a very long period of time. And now all of a sudden it's starting to ask them to do something completely different. And that's challenging. Of course it is. I think also a lot of farmers up here, fell farming is hard work, and you have to put in a huge amount of time and energy and love and dedication to it, such that you haven't got a huge amount of time to kind of look up and take stock of what's going on. So all of a sudden there's this kind of external force which is saying, we don't value what, or they're hearing it as saying, we don't value what you're doing. We want you to be doing something completely different. And so I think that has caused this sort of polarization between the sort of the people that have been working on the land often for generations and those that they perceive as being sort of the outsiders, the government agencies, the conservation organizations. And I think in the Lake District, it's particularly stark because there is this massive pride in the sort of the cultural heritage and the traditions around hefted sheep flocks on the fells, the shaping of the landscape and the building of the dry stone walls and all that kind of stuff. And I think that just it's more pronounced in the Lake District than I think in many other areas. So the division feels even more stark.
And so would it be fair to say that at RSPB Haweswater, what you're trying to do is essentially bring back some of that diversity? So it's less intense farming, it's a more diverse range of livestock and other economic activity on the land, and then recovering nature as a kind of midpoint between perhaps rewilding on one end of the spectrum and conventional fell farming on the other. Is that a kind of fair synopsis?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've tried to make it clear in the book that there is no one right answer here. So the things that I describe that we've done are specific to our quite unique context. We've got this nationally important reservoir, as you said, 2 million people getting their drinking water from it every day, which and that water really, that is the most important product that's coming from that landscape economically and in pretty much every other way, really. So we need to make sure that water is protected. The interventions that we're making to protect the water, so changing grazing so that the vegetation is rougher, so that it sort of acts as a better filter for water flowing across the surface, planting more trees to encourage water to infiltrate better. All of those things are also really good for wildlife. They're also, generally speaking, really quite good for carbon sequestration as well. So it's delivering those range of benefits. But every single valley, I think, in the Lake District is doing some of the things that we're doing. There's very few places that aren't planting trees now, somewhere or other, and it might be they're just planting them in a tiny little scruffy field corner that they don't need, but actually they're still doing it. A lot of people are diversifying the grazing regimes, reducing livestock numbers. Lots of people are blocking up drains in peat bog and things. And so it's just about the kind of the mix of all those different options. And for our particular context, we've turned up some of those options much higher than we have for some of the other ones. But I think what we're showing is that you can have rewilding type projects. With the river restoration work that we've done, where we put the meanders back in, you could comfortably describe that as rewilding. But that river is meandering its way through a traditional hay meadow, which is definitely not rewilding. That is farming. It's old-fashioned farming, and it's got lots of natural benefit, lots of biodiversity gain, but it's not rewilding. So hopefully we're sort of demonstrating that there are there is a very big menu of options that different people can select from, really, to apply to their land to deliver a range of different outcomes.
And in the book, you talk about going to Europe on 2 trips, one to Norway and one to Italy. Is that right? To look at how they manage their upland landscapes, to kind of seek inspiration. And you found it, and you came back inspired and hopeful that we could do something better with the upland landscapes that we have here in Britain. Can you describe those trips and what it is that they do differently on the continent, and what it is that you'd like us to learn from them?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're generally not very good at looking outside of our own borders at things. We feel the need to kind of start from scratch with everything, and there's an awful lot that we can learn from other places. So Norway was the most inspiring for me and the most relevant because the landscape is so similar. The Norwegian hills are formed through the same period of glaciation. They're made of essentially the same rocks as most of Scotland. The plants that grow there are almost all the same plants as we have here. But the difference is that even though so up until 150 years ago, the Norwegian landscape looked very similar to a lot of upland Scotland and the Lake District. It was largely open. It was sheep farmed, and it was not in great shape. You know, people were burning peat, cutting peat to burn it because the trees had all gone, just like a lot of people were doing here. And then the country became so poor that there was mass emigration, just huge swathes of the rural population just upped and left. A lot of them went to America, and the pressure on the countryside just fell away basically. And there was about a century of just abandonment across a huge swathe. And because a lot of these sort of glacial valleys had these little refuges where little pockets of trees and woodland and natural vegetation had hung on, that all just tumbled off the cliffs and crags and just retook the whole landscape again, basically. So all of the plants and the trees, the birds, the insects have had a century just to kind of reestablish themselves and find the places that they want to be again. And a lot of the species that I was seeing were things that in this country are hugely vulnerable. You know, there's one plant that I write about in the book called pyramidal bugle, which exists in a single location in the whole of England on a cliff ledge, not too far from Haweswater. You know, I saw it all over the place in Norway. And, you know, it clearly doesn't want to be just growing on a single ledge. It's just our land management legacy that's forced these things into these tiny, vulnerable little fragments. So I'm not suggesting that we need to have 100 years of land abandonment, but it shows you what these habitats want to be like, you know, how they should be. And in the UK, there is really no opportunity to see that because we have impacted the whole country very significantly, be it through farming or be it through superabundance of deer in Scotland, through you know, changing the nutrient balance, through you know, too much excessive use of slurry and what have you, industrial pollution. You know, all these things have touched pretty much every square inch of the countryside. So yeah, it was just really instructive. And so you know, we're doing lots of things at Haweswater to rebuild these habitats. And so seeing which species we should plant where was really, you know, was really instructive. Just, you know, wouldn't have got the opportunity to do that anywhere else. And then in the Alps is less ecologically comparable, but the management is really interesting in that it's still a cultural landscape, just like the Lake District is. You know, it's still, even those really high mountains, they're all farmed, but they're farmed so lightly. And the sheep and the cattle that live up in those mountains for the summer are generally actively shepherded, so the people are with those livestock pretty much all the time. And that was how things were here until fairly recently. So you look around the Lake District and you see ruined buildings all over the place. Those were places that shepherds were living to tend to their livestock. And you know, 500 years ago they had to do that because we still had wolves and lynx in the landscape that needed to be dissuaded from eating the sheep. And so we've lost a lot of those traditions, and they've moved into something else which is now considered traditional, but really is just a symptom of the sort of the intensity that we've had over recent decades.
So how do we bring farmers in this country on the journey that you're starting in Haweswater? And as you say, farmers will take different decisions that are right for their landholding and their business. But I mean, in the book, you recount stories of other farmers who are on this journey, either that they were on it before you, or they've started in part because they were inspired by what you guys are doing at Haweswater. How have you gone about that community engagement, and what is it that perhaps policymakers could do, as well as others in the conservation and farming community, to bring more farmers in our upland landscapes on this journey to a better balance between nature and the production of food?
So I think the things that have been proposed in the Environment Bill, you know, the concept of public payments for public goods could be transformative if we do it right. You know, so we've put in an application for landscape recovery bid. But you know, I'm seeing lots of, are we going to go forward with, you know, the EFRA committee? There's some quite concerning suggestions in the chair's opening address there. You know, if we get this right, this is the opportunity to make the change that we need to see. And it will be difficult. You know, there will be farmers that will fall by the wayside. I think there will be farmers who will reject the whole idea of doing this and will try to farm their way out of it and just farm intensively and just dispense with any kind of public investment. And in some places that will work. In very marginal places like the Lake District, I don't believe it will. I think they might make a go of it for a little while, but once the money is completely gone, I just don't think that is a viable prospect. But the really exciting thing, and I think the thing that the increases in fertilizer costs that we're seeing at the moment should really help to focus minds, is that farming in this way, farming in the way that we're doing, is better for farm businesses as well as for the environment. You know, by farming within the carrying capacity of the land, by not putting on fertilizer, by not buying in supplementary feedstock, by drastically cutting down those input costs, you are automatically in a much better position than you would be otherwise. So generally speaking, without the public payments, sheep farming makes a loss. And that is pretty well across the board in the uplands, in the places where, you know, the growing season is short, the grass isn't very nutritious, all that kind of stuff. So, you know, farming in this way, yes, the trade-off is that you're producing less, but actually, if you look at the nutritional balances associated with a lot of these farms, and we did this for our farms, once you factor in the nutrients that are coming in the shape of concentrated feedstuffs, actually generally you might even be producing negative calories. And that was what we found with our farm. So we carried on with the model that our previous tenant was doing, and we were buying concentrated feedstuffs. And bear in mind that these are made out of soya often. You know, these are grown in places where we could be growing food directly for people. If we farm just using the freely available grass that the sun, the water and nature is giving us without all those costly inputs, then the meat that we're providing doesn't have any of those input costs in. The farm business is better, and the environmental improvement comes almost by accident. So even if a farmer isn't interested in it, it's kind of going to happen anyway, just through that reduction in the intensity. So it's just that we just need to keep focused on that concept of public payments for public goods and for rewarding farmers to produce the things that the market doesn't give a value for at the moment. And the thought that principle might be eroded is terrifying to me, to be honest. It feels like we are moving in such a positive direction, and to put that in jeopardy would be just heartbreaking.
So hopefully I can reassure you slightly. So last week, the Conservative Environment Network launched our leadership pledge for the candidates currently running to be the next leader of the party and Prime Minister. And in that, at the top line of that was a commitment to continue with the reform of subsidies after Brexit. And 4 out of 5 of the candidates have signed up to that pledge. Actually 4 of 4 now. Kemi Badnock, who didn't sign up, has dropped out today, lost the vote today. So the 4 candidates still on the running to be the next Prime Minister have signed up to continuing that transition. So hopefully I can provide some reassurance, but you're absolutely right. We need that public incentive. It's good for food production in the short term by substituting fertilizer and other input requirements, but it's also in the long term mitigating those environmental threats to domestic food production from climate change, from biodiversity collapse, from soil depletion, and the rest of it. But also that strong market signal combined with public policy payments. What about also kind of new private markets for biodiversity, for water quality, for flood mitigation, for all the other services that you're providing at Haweswater? Do you think there's a role for private buyers to come in there and purchase some of those services too?
Yeah, there is. I don't have a huge amount of knowledge and expertise about how they work, but certainly I get emails from a range of people quite regularly saying we'd like to invest in this, whether that's corporate social responsibility or carbon trading or whatever. So yeah, the appetite seems huge, but at the moment it feels quite complicated. Yeah. Quite there's still work to be done there, clearly, but yeah, I'm sure that's definitely going to be part of the mix, isn't it? I think also the opportunity for generating income through ecotourism and what have you is huge. I mean, I think it's probably a little bit overplayed as being the sort of the replacement for farming income, but it's certainly part of the mix. And again, that is a kind of a traditional approach to things. It's not putting all your eggs in one basket. You know, the farmers up here would have been, as well as the livestock and the wool and all the different other types of livestock that they had, would have also been off kind of working down the mine. And, you know, the farming was just like one of the things that people did. And we kind of need to get back to that, I think. So the ecotourism initiatives that we've set up are, you know, all very small scale, low impact. You know, what we don't want to do at Haweswater is increase the footfall, particularly because it's, you know, part of why the area is special is because it's quiet and off the beaten track. So things like memorial trees, you know, photography hides, you know, they're already generating probably as much, probably more actually, more income than the livestock do, for much less effort. And the appetite just seems to be growing all the time for that kind of thing. So I think there's a whole suite of options for generating income in a really sustainable way.
And how about your relationship with United Utilities? So, I mean, because I'm sure there'll be people listening to this who have got a pretty negative view of water companies at the moment, with all the controversy around sewage discharges and a lack of investment in infrastructure and the natural environment more widely. But you've got a really positive relationship in terms of the work you're doing at Haweswater with United Utilities. How does that work? How does that support what you're doing? And how can that model of partnership between private sector, kind of non-governmental organizations and others be replicated elsewhere?
So yeah, our relationship is a really positive one. I mean, we wouldn't be doing anything without United Utilities. The genesis of the relationship, well, the RSPB appeared at Haweswater in 1969 to look after the eagles, basically, when they returned. And so our relationship with United Utilities, who own the whole of the 10,000 hectare catchment around Haweswater, has been evolving over sort of a period of decades. And in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s, we started working with them in a more serious way on trialing different approaches to land management. Initially just at a single farm scale and looking at how the farming could be tweaked, how watercourses could be buffered by fencing them out, how trees could be planted, all of the kind of stuff I've been talking about already. And those principles that were established on that one farm trial were scaled up to become the Sustainable Catchment Management Programme, or SCAMP for short. And that was United Utilities really leading the field in catchment management, and it got the concept of catchment management really solidly established, and now it's something that Ofwat talk about a lot. You know, all the water companies are doing it to a greater or a lesser extent. And then through that period where the sort of the SCAMP process was being rolled out, the two tenants of Nadell and Swindale farms, where we are now the tenants, they weren't interested in changing. Basically, they didn't want to take on this new approach, so they were prepared to let their tenancies be bought out by United Utilities, and we took on that tenancy. So we pay United Utilities a rent, but we are also their partner in that we're working to a shared management plan. So we're making the day-to-day decisions, but you know, we're in regular dialogue with them. We have, you met John, we've got a really good relationship on a personal level with a whole load of the local staff. And so, yeah, it works really, really well. I think one of the reasons it works particularly well with United Utilities is that they own quite a lot more of their catchments than other water companies do. So quite a lot of water companies have just the reservoir and a bit of land around it and their treatment works, and they don't own the land where that's having an influence on how that water is delivered to them. So that gives them a bit of an advantage, I suppose. But I think it's about public support, really. One of the things that United Utilities really struggle with is any negative feedback, anything that looks like controversy, basically affects their share price. They have a any I can't remember what the system is called, but if they have a kind of a scoring system basically on the amount of negative commentary they get from the public. Any complaints they get really affects them. So they're very, very cautious about doing anything that seemed to be too out there. So, you know, they don't like what we're doing to be described as rewilding. They're quite nervous about the potential for reintroducing beavers, and everything we do has to go through a very tortuous process to kind of get their approval. So I think, yeah, really it's about kind of building public awareness and public support, and then it will be much easier for water companies to enter into these same sorts of relationships with organisations like ours. And we're already talking with Yorkshire Water as are the national trusts. Southwest Water do quite a bit, I think, with, is it Devon Wildlife Trust? So there are a range of these partnerships out there. But yeah, I think generating more awareness with people, with those customers, that this is the right thing to be doing, would make it a lot easier for them.
That's really interesting. Well, to those listening, please do send your questions in via the question and answer box. I see we've already had one from Don Stimpson, which I'll come to shortly. But for those listening, please do send in your questions, and we'll come to those in a second. I've got a couple more for you though, Lee. The first thing is around reintroductions. So you open and kind of and close the book with the story of the last golden eagle in England perishing at Haweswater, and you want Haweswater to be the first site at which that species returns. You just mentioned beavers. In the book, you reference lots of place names which are inspired by lynx or wolf or other species which once roamed these landscapes. What role do you think reintroductions will play at Haweswater in the future? What role do you think reintroductions will play in the wider kind of nature recovery agenda at a national level? And how can you maintain this balance that you've crafted between food production, nature recovery, keeping farming and farmers and local communities on side, with some of the more ambitious plans that you may have around species reintroductions and rewilding?
I think reintroductions have a hugely important role to play, but I think we need to be careful not to focus on them too much. The most important thing is getting the habitat right, and then for big mobile species like eagles, if the habitat's right, they'll find us. That's what happened before 1969. We've actually had 2 of the southern Scotland golden eagle projects birds visit us in the last couple of months. So they're all sat tagged. And then actually at the back end of last year, we had 2 white-tailed eagles from the Isle of Wight visit us as well. And what was really exciting about all of those 4 birds visiting us was that they all seemed to make a particular detour for Haweswater. So the golden eagles, actually, they came across the border, they came to Haweswater, they flew around for a day, and then they went straight back to Scotland again. They didn't go anywhere else. And one of the studies that was carried out to underpin the South of Scotland Translocation project basically identified eagles, kind of golden eagles, like site faithfulness. So sites that had been used historically can be abandoned for long periods of time, and then the eagles find them again. So there's obviously something that they look for in the landscape that appeals to them. And so hopefully these 2 birds were kind of scoping us out for future potentially. And the white-tailed eagles both were kind of heading north, and both of the flight paths had this very noticeable kink where they came into Haweswater and then they kind of went off again. And Riggindale, the valley where the golden eagles bred for most of the time they were with us, has an eagle crag in it, and it also has a heron crag, which is a derivation of ern for white-tailed eagles. So both eagle species have nested there in the past. So yes, but there are other species, of course, that are not likely to get to us by themselves, and which reintroduction needs to be considered as and when the habitat is suitable. So beavers we're very interested in, and we know we've got lots of suitable beaver habitat, and they would indeed make the habitat even better. We're looking at a water vole reintroduction. Mink wiped them out, and we're busy getting shot of the mink, and the water voles were here until quite recently. Pine martins are probably not needed. The reintroduction is not needed. They're kind of spreading down from Scotland, and the sightings of them are increasing in Cumbria at the moment anyway. Wildcats, I think, are definitely worth looking at, and obviously Derek Gow and others are kind of busy trialing that in other parts of the country. We're looking at marsh, so it's not just the kind of big sexy species. We're looking at marsh fritillary butterfly, which has been reintroduced into Cumbria already, but again probably isn't going to get to us by itself because there's big mountains in the way that they're unlikely to fly over. And then we do lots with plants as well: downy willow, pyramidal bugle, species that are just hanging on in these tiny fragments that should be much more widespread. We're kind of translocating those as well. So yeah, reintroductions are hugely important. But as you say, they do have the potential to kind of inflame local tensions. I think much less controversial when a species colonizes by itself. And that doesn't, the moment, although consultation is clearly a good worthy thing to do, it also just massively unleashes a whole load of demons. So Ennerdale over in the west of the Lake District is considering a beaver reintroduction at the moment, and the consultations that they've done have just been awful, really awful. People have just come out of the woodwork and just expressed these incredibly opposed views. And if the question wasn't asked, what do you think about beaver reintroductions, it probably would have happened and they probably wouldn't have even noticed. So there is a risk of kind of over consulting, I think, sometimes with these things. But we have to maintain good, positive relationships with our local community. So, any proposal that we're going to be doing, we're going to, work as hard as we possibly can to make sure people are informed, but making sure it's the right people and not just the people that feel like jumping on a soapbox and making noise for the sake of it, which unfortunately people like that do exist.
And to play devil's advocate for a second, two points to you. What do you say to those who are concerned about, for example, the impact of beavers on nearby farmland? So the farmers which might be impacted by these reintroductions, how do you reassure them? How do you make sure that they aren't just compensated, but also benefit from this agenda? And what would you say to those, perhaps those in perhaps politicians or commentators or those in the farming community or in the public at large, who would say to you, this is all well and good, but we've got a war in Ukraine, we've got global issues with food supply, we've got food prices going up and a cost of living crisis. Actually, this isn't the moment for species reintroductions and nature recovery. We need to be doubling down with our focus on food production.
So for the beaver question, the Lake District, because it's a place of very kind of steep-sided valleys, there isn't a huge amount of flat, flood-prone land. That land that's flood-prone is wet anyway, and so the impact that beavers will have is relatively slight compared with somewhere like East Anglia or somewhere, if you're blocking up artificial drains. So I think there is a reduced risk of that here. There's also a lot of open water already, and beavers won't modify the hydrology if they don't need to. If they've got plenty to eat and they've got lots of deep water to give them the security, as the lakes offer huge amounts of, then they generally won't bother. But of course, we just need to be pragmatic and recognize that our ecosystem is wildly out of balance and is going to continue to be. And these are a species that are going to need managing, just like we have to manage deer and many other types of wildlife. So, we can look out of our own borders. We can learn lessons from Germany and lots of other places in Europe that now live perfectly comfortably alongside beavers, and recognize that sometimes lethal control is necessary, sometimes translocation is needed, and there are places where beavers will be more welcome than others. And I think that's not beyond the wit of man at all, really.
So just to go on that, so and what about using perhaps the public money, public goods structure and schemes, perhaps to reward those land managers and farmers who have beavers on their land for the kind of services that those beavers are providing, whether it's flood mitigation or water purification and the rest of it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, flooding is such a huge issue in Cumbria. We've been hammered by Storm Desmond in 2015, and before that it was 2009, and it happens again and again and again. So keeping that water up in the upper catchment for as long as we possibly can to reduce the risks to places like Carlisle is a no-brainer, really, and beavers could hugely help us in that. And I'm sure it would work out. Paying farmers to have a bit more water on their land, whether through leaky dams or through beaver engineered wetlands, is surely going to be much better use of public money than pouring huge quantities of concrete to put flood defense schemes in. Yeah. So yeah, that seems like a really sensible use of public money to me.
Excellent. And on the supposed tension between nature recovery, reintroductions, and the challenge that we're facing globally with food supplies at the moment.
Yeah. So again, I think a lot of this comes down to economic arguments. The flooding costs. I think Storm Desmond, I think it was £500 million cleanup bill. Even if we can take a bit of the edge off of that by re-wetting bogs and reintroducing beavers and planting more trees, that's a very good use of public money. I mean, the food security argument really holds no water at all when it comes to when you understand that sheep are the primary product from a lot of these upland landscapes. lamb is consumed in increasingly small quantities. I think it makes up something like 1% of our national diet, and yet we're putting about 30% of the land aside to produce it. We have sheep because historically, because they provided both food and fiber. The wool is basically a waste product nowadays, which is a tragedy, but it's the case. And the taste for sheep, lamb and mutton is falling all the time, really. So yes, we need food security, we need it produced in a sensible way, but let's actually look at what the food we're producing does for our diets, for our economy. A huge amount of our sheep is exported. So that's not whose food security are we worrying about? We're worrying about our food security or food security of France or wherever we're sending it.
It's really important to distinguish between different areas of the country and the kind of variation in productivity of the land and their contribution to our overall food output. And up in the uplands, and there's a fantastic image in the National Food Strategy, which kind of maps food production on top of potential for land-based carbon removal, on top of potential for nature recovery, and demonstrates actually in the areas that make a very, very marginal contribution to our calories. I think it's about 3%. The 20% least productive land contributes 3% of our calories, but actually those are the areas that are most suitable for the kind of nature recovery work that you're doing at Haweswater. And there's a kind of fortuitous kind of overlap between these objectives.
Yeah, absolutely. And those places can certainly do a lot of that nature recovery and still produce some livestock, just not as much as was being produced before, especially if we also factor in venison. There is food that can be produced there that we should be making much, much better use of than we do at the moment. And that would be hugely beneficial. Deer is a huge issue that needs tackling locally and across the country.
Yeah,
far too many deer.
Yeah, we need to eat more venison. Right, I'm going to go to the audience Q&A now. So Donna Stimpson, who's a CEN councillor in Windsor and Maidenhead, and she's spoken about working as a councillor, working with the farmers in her area who are doing lots of innovative biodiversity work of their own volition, but she's worried that the kind of food rewilding kind of false binary is going to raise its head again this year. I'd argue it already has, as recession and food security challenges hit. So what would be your advice to Donna as a local councillor to keep farmers on the trajectory towards more kind of nature-friendly regenerative farming? But
buy them all a copy of Jake Fiennes' book if they're in the lowlands, or buy a book if they're in the uplands, or indeed James Rebanks's book. We just need to share. I know not everybody reads books, or not everyone has the time to do so, but there are a growing number of examples of how you can do both. NEP obviously is not producing a huge amount of food, but it is producing food and delivering these wonderful outcomes for nature. So I think just trying to share as many of those examples with people as possible, and I think connecting people up is so important. Connecting up farmers that are doing different things, that are going against the grain, having to suffer the challenges of kind of peer pressure and what have you, is so valuable. So the nature friendly farming network is hugely valuable, I think, for that, in making people feel a little bit safer in numbers. So recommending a kind of membership of that, I think, would be really worthwhile. But just offering whatever reassurance you can, I suppose, and sharing as many examples as you can.
Fantastic. Yes, actually, that's given me an idea. We should, in the next councillor newsletter, we should do a reading list for our councillors, looking at some of these issues, whether it's Jake's book or your book, or some of the other fantastic books that have come out in recent years that have looked at this issue of reconciling kind of nature climate and food production. So that's a fantastic idea, and we'll certainly do that. Martin Lyons at the Nature Friendly Farming Network, Donna's just said, is also a great person to chat to and get inspiration from. So Chris McGone said, this is fascinating and inspiring. It's interesting to hear about your experiences in other parts of Europe and what you learned there. But I'm watching this whilst on a visit to South Africa, and you'll be aware of species collapse in Africa: elephant, rhino, cheetah, and numerous others. To what extent are you in touch with organisations in other much more impoverished parts of the world, such as across Africa, about the kind of approach that you're taking? And since he's an academic, to what extent do you engage with universities, e.g. the major Water at Leeds research programme, for input into what they're doing? Is there enough collaboration between practitioners and academics in a nutshell?
So I'm not all that connected with sort of international organisations. Horswater, I am in effect a farmer with a site. Although I work for an NGO, what I do at Horswater takes up the entirety of my working life. I'm very conscious that there's some horrendous issues happening in Africa and around the world, but I'm not involved with many of those discussions. Though interestingly, I did just have my wife's two cousins that were here that farm out in Kenya at the moment, and they were talking about some really exciting stuff, some big innovations. A lot of sort of the regenerative farming stuff that people are talking about doing here are being scaled up in quite a big way out there. Actually, lots of no-till farming. One of my wife's cousins is involved with a sort of big farming cooperative where they're pulling together a whole network of farmers that are doing this much more sustainable farming approach, including sort of local subsistence farmers, as well as some sort of big agri businesses and things. My understanding is there is quite a lot of innovation happening out there as well, which is encouraging. But there's nowhere is free of these challenges, sadly. In terms of engagement with academic institutions, we have lots at Horswater actually. So we've just recently recruited a conservation scientist to the team, and she's going to be helping to establish both some sort of physical facilities and also develop the relationships with a range of academic partners in the area to carry out a whole raft of different research projects looking at different grazing regimes, public goods delivery, carbon sequestration, all that kind of stuff. Water at Leeds, we have a good relationship with. We've just had a PhD student, Felicity Munger, who's just finished with us. She was based at Horswater for all of her field work. She's had a couple of really good papers put out about the benefits of woodland on ecosystem services. And another student, Stephanie Bond, who's done another couple of similar papers as well. So we're pretty linked in with them. Lancaster University, York University. I've just taken the approach of just, if we get approached by an academic, I just say yes, and let that work happen, because generally speaking, it's no skin off our nose. We've got lots of data that we can share with people about management regimes and historic monitoring and things. And that those data sets, I hope, will kind of build and make us an even more appealing place to come and do that research as time goes on.
In terms of providing data and resource that others can draw upon, are you supporting other farm businesses in the area who are looking at your kind of business model of diversification and seeing whether that's something they can replicate?
Yeah.
Open your books up to other farmers, essentially, because I think that would be one of a really powerful tool. I've been speaking to colleagues at the Nature Friendly Farming Network about this. Opening up your books and showing other farmers that this is better for business would be quite powerful, I think, in terms of that inspiring others along the journey and that peer-to-peer knowledge exchange.
No, we did do that. So we did an economic report in 2016, which was when we were still running with the relatively intensive farming model that we inherited, and that highlighted very starkly just how fragile these farm businesses are. And those books went into we were one of the study farms for that Less is More report by Chris Clark, which showed the extreme vulnerability, and that by scaling back and cutting back on inputs was a sensible approach from an economic point of view as well as an environmental one. But we need to update that, and that's on my list of things to do. But the opportunity to do much more of this is about to land with us, in that we've just secured an endangered landscapes program award. So that's $5 million over the next 5 years. And that's a partnership project with us and the Lowther Estate, who are a huge landowner just immediately next door to us, and United Utilities and Natural England. And the real focus of that is basically trying to help the farmers in our project area to transition to that nature-friendly farming approach, because it's all well and good providing the funding, but actually, where's the expertise? How do people make that bridge from one model to the next? And so that's going to give us, I think, 7 new members of staff. There's going to be business advice there. There's going to be ecological mapping available through the project. And the vision for that project is basically we've got these 2 kind of core areas: Lowther, who are doing a kind of NEP of the North thing, and then us just a little bit further up the valley. And then that surrounding network is sort of permeable to wildlife. So it's a landscape that wildlife can sort of thrive in and move across. So more connectivity, more hedges, more restored rivers, and that becomes kind of self-sustaining. So that's got a big focus on venison, on kind of locally reared produce and helping people get it to market. So yeah, I hope that although it's focused on an area of about 30,000 hectares, I hope is that will grow, and we'll be able to set up kind of networks for selling produce and stuff that can expand out into the wider landscape. So it's quite exciting.
That's really exciting. Yeah, that's fantastic. Okay, I'm going to finish with just a couple of quick fire questions. We'll try and do this to each of the authors that we have on, and then we'll have to wrap up, I'm afraid, because we're soon running out of time. So firstly, do you see yourself as a conservationist, farmer, author, or all of the above?
I'm a conservationist, really.
Yeah. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of the uplands in this country?
I think if government sticks to your guns, and public payments for public goods is rolled out in a sensible way, then I'm hugely optimistic.
And links back in our landscapes in our lifetime, yes or no?
In Scotland, I reckon, yes.
Fantastic. And the golden eagle back at Haweswater, are you optimistic that will happen before the time you retire from the
I hope so. I've written it into the book, so it's got to happen now.
It's got to happen now. Yeah. Fantastic. And where next, Lee? What's next for you? Is there another book in the offing, or you've focused on what you're doing up at Haweswater?
I have to recuperate from this one first, I think. And it's a decade of my working life gone into this, so I need to get some more experiences and think about how to share them in future. But yeah, lots to keep me busy at Haweswater for now.
Brilliant, fantastic, thank you. That was brilliant, really informative, and we will put this up on YouTube for everyone to catch up on, and we'll share it more widely on social media. But thank you to Lee for joining us. If you haven't read Wildfell, please buy yourself a copy and read it. It's absolutely fantastic. And we look forward to seeing you all at the next CEN Book Club in due course. Thanks very much.
Thanks, James. Thanks all.
Bye.